Okay, welcome to number 17 in the series of ChideStudyPress's Chinese Australian History. And today I'm introducing a topic that I think isn't done enough, and that is comparative histories. And here what I've done is I've compared Chinese return migration with Italians. And I think for very useful results. Of course, I mean, the obvious problem with doing comparatives is that you have to try and be expert in two areas, and this is, of course, very difficult. Obviously, I've spent many more years studying Chinese Australian history than I have Italian migration history, but nevertheless, I think a great many interesting things have come from that. Better would be to do some kind of cooperative work, but I've found that people aren't that interested in doing this kind of thing. People who do Italian migration or more broadly European migration have little or no interest in things Asian and vice versa, which is a very great pity. But nevertheless, I think this proves the value of this kind of work, and I think our bots once again have discussed this area. They do make a few slight problems with pronunciation. They pronounce Qing, King. You know, they don't get that Q sound. I should rewrite that as a CH sound for them, but I think you get the idea. Chao Khan. They mean rather than the Chiao Khan pronunciation. So again, these are small, minor problems, but as to be expected when using how friendly bots. Anyway, I hope you enjoy.
What really drives huge movements of people, like migration? I mean, is it always about finding a totally new, permanent home?
Or is there something else going on, something maybe more complicated?
Exactly. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating comparison. We're looking at Chinese and Italian migration to Australia and the U.S.
Right, late 19th, early 20th century.
And we're basing this on a great article by Michael Williams. It really makes you rethink some common ideas.
It does, because, a lot of migration studies, they tend to focus very narrowly, maybe on one ethnic group or just the big political picture.
Laws and policies.
Exactly. And what often gets missed, and what we're focusing on today, is the actual experience of individuals. And crucially, the role of their home villages.
The villages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by comparing the Chinese and the Italians, we can start to see these deeper motivations, the real reasons for the journeys, and how these communities abroad actually evolved. It's not just what happened, but why it mattered so much to them.
So our mission for you today is to get past those simple stories of just, arriving and settling down.
Right. Building a new life. End of story.
We want to understand the hidden drivers, the complex intentions, which sometimes changed, right? And the really surprising differences in how these two groups manage their journeys. Get ready for some moments, we think.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we start? What was the main thing driving both the Chinese and Italian migrants? Because they come from such different backgrounds.
It's actually quite striking. For both groups, it was mostly about what you'd call return labor migration. These were largely peasants from villages that didn't have much cash.
Okay, cash-poor villages.
Right. So the main goal wasn't really to find a new homeland forever. It was about earning money, sending that money back home.
Remittances.
Exactly. And then ultimately returning to their families, their land, their villages. Australia, the U.S., they were seen more as places to earn. Temporary workplaces.
Not the final stop. That shared goal is pretty amazing considering the cultural distance. It really points to something more fundamental, maybe.
I think so. And the places they came from were incredibly specific, too.
Right. You mentioned the villages.
For the Chinese, almost all came from one area, the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province. Places like Zhongshan, Taishan counties. A lot of that was because of the proximity to Hong Kong, the British port.
Makes sense. And the Italians.
Well, before about 1900, a big chunk came from a small northern region, Valtellina, in Lombardy.
Valtellina, okay.
They had these routes through Switzerland to Hamburg to catch the ships. Now, later on, Italian migration to the U.S. became much more southern Italian.
Right, I've heard that.
Hundreds of thousands by 1910, mostly from the south. But interestingly, San Francisco kept that northern Italian majority for longer.
Wow, okay. So specific regions feeding into specific destinations almost. What about the numbers? How many people are we talking about?
Well, let's look at Australia. Say between 1876 and 1918, you had about 35,000 Chinese arrivals and roughly 18,200 Italians.
Okay. But the Chinese numbers had actually peaked way earlier, tens of thousands during the gold rushes in the 1850s, 60s. Italian numbers were tiny then, just hundreds, but climbed after 1870.
And the U.S., you said hundreds of thousands of Italians.
Yeah, huge numbers by 1900.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. The return rates were incredibly high for both groups.
They actually went back.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
For Italians, early 20th century, one report said 9 out of 10 returned in 1904. Between 1912 and 1915, it was 60%.
Wow.
And Chinese return rates were calculated at least 60% as well. So these weren't people just trying to escape. They were trying to support home from afar.
So it really wasn't just individuals heading off alone. This was tied tightly to family, to the community back home.
Absolutely central. And the families back home, especially the women, they often became the ones in charge, essentially.
De facto heads of the household.
You got it. Controlling the land, managing the money sent back. You see it in the population numbers. The gender ratios were really skewed.
Like how skewed? Well, for Italians in Australia in 1911, it was almost 5 men for every 1 woman.
Whoa.
And for the Chinese, maybe 75% of the men were married to women who stayed behind in the Pearl River Delta villages.
So communication must have been vital. Letters.
Primarily letters, yeah. And often those letters were just full of instructions on how to spend the money.
Running the household budget from across the world.
Pretty much. A first trip back might happen after, say, 5 or 10 years, but it often wasn't the last one. Many made multiple trips back and forth.
Wow.
Some Italians on the U.S. East Coast, because it was, relatively closer, apparently even returned seasonally sometimes. It shows how tied these migrations were to family plans.
That's a huge shift in family dynamics, the women taking charge like that. But, okay, if the goal was supporting the villages, making them better, did it work? You mentioned an irony earlier.
Yes, this is where it gets really fascinating. Kind of sad, actually.
So?
Well, the goal was to support the villages, but what often happened was they became, centers of consumerism. Yeah. Meaning the families got really dependent on the money coming in from overseas. They often didn't develop their own local ways to generate income. So the villages largely stayed poor, agriculturally based.
So the money coming in almost stopped them from developing independently.
In a way, yes. The success of the migrants abroad kind of stunted local economic growth. And this dependence, plus all the new money floating around, changes to old ways.
Yeah.
It often created a lot of tension when the migrants finally came back for good.
Right. Adjusting must have been hard on everyone.
Very difficult. The separation caused changes that were hard to bridge when they returned.
And these weren't just isolated trips, were they? You mentioned networks.
Oh, definitely global networks. For the Italians, you had family and village connections stretching all across Europe, North and South America.
Wow.
And for the Chinese, networks across the Pacific, San Francisco, Hawaii, Mexico, Peru, you name it, plus all through Southeast Asia.
So the villages themselves were nodes in these huge global systems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whether it was Valtellina or the Pearl River Delta, they were plugged into global income and labor migration streams that often went back generations before this period, a really complex web.
Okay, so if the basic motivation, earning money to send home and return, was so similar, where did things start to look different? Why were their experiences and how people reacted to them so distinct?
That's a key question. One big difference was just the scale and then the level of organization that came with it.
How do you mean?
Well, the Chinese migrants were often in larger numbers earlier on, especially in places like Australia during the gold rush. This allowed a kind of business elite to develop within the community.
Oh, okay. So they built their own structures.
Right. Extensive commercial networks, not just within Australia or America, but linking back to Hong Kong, China, other places in the Pacific. Think about newspapers, for example. There were successful Chinese language newspapers running from the 1890s right through to the 1930s. And they carried ads not just from Chinese businesses, but non-Chinese ones too. They were commercially viable.
And the Italians?
Well, Italian language papers tended to be pretty short-lived. Smaller readership, maybe fewer broad commercial connections like the Chinese had developed. They often just couldn't make it work financially, so that internal commercial backbone wasn't quite as strong.
That's a significant difference, having that internal economy. What about politics? I know Chinese migrants were often involved in politics back home, right?
Yeah.
Anti-king stuff.
Yes, very much so. Strong anti-king feelings, support for revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen. That political engagement was quite prominent.
And the Italians, were they trying to influence Italian politics from abroad?
Generally, no. Most seem to have been largely uninterested in Italian politics, at least until World War I.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah, then many did volunteer to fight for Italy. But before that, not so much political engagement. And this difference kind of carried over into how they reintegrated when they went back home, too.
How so?
Chinese returnees, often they seem to fit back in more smoothly, they'd contribute to the community, maybe help with modernization efforts, generally less friction. Italian returnees, though, the accounts suggest much trickier relationships. Hostility sometimes, suspicion, jealousy from those who stayed behind.
Ouch.
Yeah, and sometimes this led to them building these big, flashy show homes almost to prove their success, maybe, because the community was skeptical. Less about contributing, more about display.
Fascinating psychological difference there. Okay, so
Yeah.
different organization, different political ties. How did they actually manage the nuts and bolts of sending money and letters across the world?
Another big difference here, the Chinese developed this amazing self-contained system.
Self-contained.
Yeah, they had these gold mountain firms. Think of them as integrated networks, often tied to specific dialects or home districts.
Okay.
These firms did everything. They carried letters, they transferred money, they even arranged for the bones of people who died overseas to be sent back to their home villages. They had branches everywhere, Australia, San Francisco, Hawaii, Hong Kong, right back in the villages themselves.
Wow, that's incredible infrastructure.
And they had things like Kwaiokan, overseas Chinese magazines to keep those community links strong.
Okay, so a whole ecosystem. What about the Italians? How did they get money home?
It seems they didn't have quite that same kind of dedicated, self-contained system. Initially, they might rely on friends traveling back or maybe specialist agents, bancista, who worked with private Italian banks.
Right.
Later on, they started using the developing international banking system more. Sometimes the governments pushed for it, like the U.S. government insisting the Bank of Napoli provide services for the Italian diaspora.
So more reliant on external systems, maybe.
Arguably, yes. You could say the greater isolation the Chinese faced in some ways forced them to develop these more intense internal mechanisms for return migration.
That makes a lot of sense. Different pressures leading to different solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. How were they received? Australia, the U.S., these white settler nations, as you call them. How did they react to these two groups?
Well, the backdrop for both was definitely a racist and discriminatory environment. There was this very problematic white-on-white divide.
Right.
Chinese people, being seen as clearly non-white, faced restrictions pretty early and consistently. They were viewed as a threat, partly because of competition over low-wage jobs.
The yellow peril kind of idea.
Exactly. And you see this codified in policy. Australia's 1901 Immigration Restriction Act, a key part of the White Australia policy. It had the famous education test, later called the dictation test.
The one where they could ask you to write in any European language?
Any prescribed language, which was usually European, yes.
Yeah.
It was basically designed to be impossible to pass, allowing them to exclude people without explicitly saying no Chinese allowed, even though that was the clear intent. It was a legal fiction, really.
Clever, in a very negative way.
Yeah.
And the U.S.?
Similar restrictions against Chinese focused heavily on the West Coast. Those were more explicitly race-based, but they did have loopholes like exemptions for merchants. This created slightly different dynamics and interactions.
Okay, so the Chinese were clearly marked as non-white and faced targeted restrictions. What about the Italians? They're European, but was it that simple?
Not always. While generally seen as European, they weren't always perceived as fully white. Especially Southern Italians, who often faced prejudice and stereotypes about being darker or less desirable Europeans.
Right, that distinction within whiteness.
Exactly. And in Australia, once the restrictions on Chinese immigration were really tight, Italians started to become a target. They were sometimes labeled the least desirable workers.
So they moved down the hierarchy, in a sense.
You could say that. And even though the prime minister at the time, Barton, said the dictation test wasn't meant for Europeans.
It was used against them sometime?
It was. It was applied to Italians and other Europeans occasionally. It just shows how fluid and, frankly, how useful these racial categories were for controlling labor and immigration.
So while the type of discrimination might have differed explicitly racial for Chinese, maybe more coded or shifting for Italians, both face significant hurdles.
Definitely. It wasn't always a neat black and white, or perhaps white on white division. Both groups felt the pressure of labor competition and these shifting racial ideas. It highlights just how complex these situations were on the ground.
Okay, we've gone through the experiences, the motivations, the reception, which have been incredibly illuminating. But this brings us to how these stories get told. How have historians dealt with these complex circular journeys? Or have they?
Oh, that's a really crucial part of the picture. There's been a significant tendency in historical writing to ignore or downplay return migration,
Really?
especially among what you might call nation-state historians. Their focus is often on the destination country, Australia, the US. The narrative tends to be about becoming Australian, becoming American.
Like the classic immigrant success story.
Exactly, from poverty to riches, from oppression to freedom. In those stories, the white settler nation is the end point, the goal. Return migration doesn't fit that narrative very well.
They just leave it out.
Often, or they minimize it. Even really good histories, say by Fitzgerald or Kuo on Chinese Australians, they acknowledge the origins in China, sure, but the whole story becomes about the settler experience in Australia. They don't really frame it as part of this ongoing circular flow with deep ties pulling people back home.
It's like telling only the second half of the journey.
Pretty much. Or the half that fits the national story better. And even studies that do talk about transnational connections can miss the specific village focus or the reality of return.
You can give an example.
Sure. Stephen Castles wrote about Italians in Australia for a journal specifically on transnationalism, but he mainly discussed it in terms of multiculturalism within Australia, not so much the ongoing links back to the villages. Or Gianfranco Cresciani, who said writing migration history means looking at two countries, which sounds right, but he still kept it at the nation-state level. Italy and Australia, not much mention of the actual villages, the dialects, the people going back.
Right. It's abstract, not grounded.
Exactly. And it's maybe no surprise then that a huge encyclopedia like the Italian-American Experience apparently gives only 2 pages out of 600 to return migration.
2 pages. That says a lot.
It really does. It shows how deeply ingrained this settlement bias is. Even in the U.S., where you have great historians like Sima Kamarklai on Chinese American history, who absolutely documents the Guangdong origins and the dialect groups.
Yes.
Their purpose in maintaining links back home often gets kind of folded into just being about how they organize themselves in America.
Yeah.
The return focus gets lost.
Okay, I see. And this connects to the language used too, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned Sojourner versus Birds of Passage.
Yes, exactly. That's a really interesting point. Why is sojourn still kind of a problematic term for Chinese American history?
Because it implies they weren't really committed.
Precisely. It was often used historically in racist ways to argue that Chinese immigrants weren't truly loyal, they weren't going to become real Americans, they were just here temporarily. That stigma didn't attach as strongly to birds of passage when applied to Italians or other Europeans.
Even though, as we've seen, huge numbers of Italians were returning.
Right. But the label itself carried different baggage.
So it seems like even modern histories, while rightly focusing on racism and discrimination, which is vital work,
Absolutely.
they still often stick to that nation-state frame and kind of gloss over the migrants' own original motivations, especially the return element.
I think that's often true. And if you look at the bigger picture, historically, European return migration seems to have been accepted more readily in the scholarship.
Why do you think that is?
Well, perhaps because Europeans could eventually be absorbed into the category of white. Their links back home, their return trips, could maybe be seen as just curiosities, temporary things that didn't fundamentally challenge the main story of settlement and becoming part of the nation.
Whereas Chinese return migration maybe felt more threatening to that narrative.
Potentially, yes. It didn't fit as easily. And this difference in how historians have treated it continues to shape how we understand these diasporas, maybe even how we misunderstand them today.
Wow. What an absolutely incredible journey through these histories. It really shows how looking at migration comparatively, side by side, reveals so much about the real motivations, the often surprising personal reasons behind these huge movements of people.
It really does. This deep dive highlights that for both the Chinese and Italians, these large diasporas we see today were often the unintended results of initial plans. Plans centered on returning home, driven by family needs, village economics.
Not necessarily a desire to leave forever.
Exactly. And the big differences we saw in how they organized, the intensity of their networks, how they were received, it just underscores how critical the specific cultural context was and how the perceptions of the host nation shaped everything.
And those differences echo even in how the stories get written by historians later on.
Absolutely. It tells us the reality of migration is just so much more complex, more nuanced than the simple stories often suggest.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What migration stories are we maybe overlooking right now in our own time? What could we learn if we looked at today's global movements more through the lens of what individuals and families actually intend, rather than just focusing on national policies or big economic trends?
That's a powerful question.
Is settling down always the plan from the start? Or is it often, like we've talked about today, more of a gradual shift, an unplanned change in circumstances, a change in plans that unfolds over time?
Well, thank you very much, our friendly bots, for their discussion of this interesting topic. I think you find that there's quite a lot of room for comparison, differences and similarities between this late 19th, early 20th century migration of Chinese and Italians. I mean, to me, the main difference was the Chinese did things very similar in many ways, but they usually did it better. They returned more, they were better at returning their remittances, they had better systems when they got back home, they integrated better back into their villages, they maintained these things for greater periods of time over longer generations. Italians, and there's others, Greeks and others that similar comparisons, return labour migrations, tended to change over time more readily or not to be as successful when it came to returning back or rebuilding houses in the villages. But nevertheless, people did things in their own way and according to their own culture. And these comparatives are not always to be used as any strict idea of saying everything's the same, but of course they're saying learning more about things by looking at the differences as well as similarities. And I think we can do the same by comparing, of course, this past with the present, as our bots also pointed out for us. Oh well, I hope you enjoyed.